Well, today we're going to take a look at Psalm 121. I know you did that in your group, but I want to start out by asking one of the questions that you have. So when you face a challenge or a crisis in your life, what is the first thing that you do? I mean, there's options. You could pray, complain, sigh, call a doctor. I've noticed that happens the older I get. I've got to call the doctor more. I don't like that. Or we could do like they did on that TV show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? We could do the 50-50, phone a friend, or poll the audience, I mean, in terms of what to do. But I think, as we take a look at Psalm 121, I think there's a few things we need to look at to help us to gain a better grasp of it, to help us to gain a sense of the context. And we want to take a look at both the literary and the historical context. Now, from the literary context, this psalm is known as one of the Psalms of Ascent. Psalms of Ascents. And this is a group of psalms from 120 to 134 in that fifth book of the Old Testament that we talked about a number of weeks ago when I was here. I hope you remember that because we're going to have a quiz on it later. But these psalms are relatively short. The shortest is 3 verses. The longest is 18 verses long. And what this is that we're looking at today is really a psalm of trust. And psalms of trust have a kind of a typical content, and it's not always exact, but it helps us in understanding that content. So a typical content for a psalm of trust would be a summons to praise, reasons to praise, and a recapitulation. Like that last word, that's a pretty good one, right? That's a $25 word. And basically, if you take a look at this psalm, verses 1 and 2 would be the summons to praise. The reasons to praise would be in verses 3 through 6, and the recapitulation would be in verses 7 and 8. Now, specifically, this psalm is thought by some to be in the form of a blessing. And it's possibly a blessing for a journey home from Jerusalem. So that's your typical content, but I think what's important for us to understand is the historical context, because there are several possibilities for this psalm. The first is it's believed that these psalms may have been sung or recited as people went up to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage for one of the different festivals that they had during the Jewish year. Now, you need to remember that Jerusalem is on the top of one of the mountains, and it's referred to like that in Psalm 48, the city of the great king in the north. And it's also that, you ascend the road to Jerusalem. You don't descend, you go up. And so the Psalms of Ascent. Second, it's possible that these psalms were sung or recited by the Israelites as they returned from exile in Babylon. And third, it's thought by some that these psalms were sung by either Levites or some other folks as they went up the steps to the temple. Okay, there were 15 steps between the court of the women and the court of the Israelites, and there's 15 Psalms of Ascent. So you go up one step and do one, the next step and do another, etc. Those things are all possibilities. But what's clear to me as we take a look at this psalm, it's clearly a psalm about a journey. It's about traveling. Now, whether it's the journey or pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the journey back from the exile, or even the journey up the steps at the temple, we don't really know for sure. We can guess. There are probabilities, there are possibilities, but what we know best is that Psalm 121 is a psalm of a journey. So as we get started, let me pray for us. Lord, I pray that you would be our teacher and our guide. I pray that you would open up our hearts and our minds, that we might learn from you. And so, Lord, comfort us with your words, challenge us with your words, cause us to think again about who you are and how much you love us and care for us. To that end, Lord, we ask that you might be glorified, for we ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, since this psalm is relatively short, I'd like to just read it for us as we get started. And I'm reading out of the New International Version. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. You know, as I look at this psalm, it seems to me very clearly that it's a statement of faith. And in verse 1, we have the question that's answered. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Well, if you're like me, this really bugs me because it's ending that question with a preposition, and you're not supposed to do that, right? Okay? I mean, I remember from my freshman year in high school this saying that a preposition isn't something to end a sentence with. Okay? You got that, so you follow me. I mean, I could do that with a younger crowd, and they would not get that. You know what I'm saying? I'm not insinuating any senior tendencies here. I'm just saying. But I think we need to get over the preposition piece of it. In fact, I actually like, in this case, I really like the King James Version, you know, from whence cometh my help. I mean, it's grammatically correct. Whatever, okay? You know, it's not uncommon at this time in this context where people would look to the mountains or to the hills for their help. Now, we might think, well, that's odd. Where are you going to find help in the mountains? Why are you going to find help in the hills? But we need to remember that back in the Old Testament days, there were all the foreign gods, okay? All the false gods. And you would go into the mountains, in the hills, to the high places. And it was on those high places where the altars were built. And so people would look and say, does my help come from that God or that God? From this mountain, from the sun, from the moon? Where does my help come from? And so you have this question that is raised. Some people believed literally that their help came from the hills and the gods that were worshipped in the hills. In addition, Derek Kidner, in his commentary on Psalm 121, also points to some other possibilities. That the hills of the mountains might be seen as a place of refuge on a journey. A place where you can find rest and where you can be safe. But it could also be a place of danger from robbers who would come and prey on the pilgrims who are traveling to Jerusalem. So as you think about this psalm, I want you to think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. You might be saying, well, why on earth would we do that? Well, a certain man went from up to Jerusalem from Jericho. Jericho's down at the bottom of the mountain. If you've been to the Holy Land, Jericho's down here, and you go up on a windy mountain road to Jerusalem. So think about that as you think about this psalm, this journey up a mountain, sharp turns, no guardrails, all that kind of stuff. And so what we have is this place that could be a place of danger, and we have this whole idea about these other gods that are there. And in contrast to finding help in the mountains necessarily, the psalmist comes back with the answer. My help comes from the Lord, the one who made the mountains, the one who made the hills, the one who made the wood and the gold or the silver that covered over those idols is the one who is worshipped. And so as the writer of this psalm says this, he makes two declarations, one implicit, one explicit. Implicitly, the psalmist declares that the gods in the hills and the gods in the mountains are useless, and that the dangers that may exist in the hills, though real, should not deter us from our faith and our trust in God. That's implicit. Explicitly, the psalmist declares that the help that is truly help comes from the Lord, the one that made the mountains and the hills. There's no question about that. Okay? And so the maker of the heavens and the earth is the one in whom we can place our trust. We don't have to place our trust in any other form of security. Our ultimate security is in the Lord Almighty, who made the heavens and the earth. The Lord who made us. The Lord who made all that there is. The Lord who is good and mighty and powerful. Well, that's the kind of God I want to trust in. I mean, money's not going to do it. Securities and exchange rates aren't going to make it happen. People are going to fail me. But God's not. Because God's the creator of the heavens and the earth. God's the one in whom we can trust. God has not failed. And so I come back to my original question. When you face a challenge or a crisis, how do you respond? I think there's really three options for us. The first is that we can come to the challenge or the crisis and react. God, get me out of this. God, why did you allow this to happen? God, do something now. Right now. Do it. As if God's at our beck and call. Okay? That's one way that we can respond. Second, we could ignore God altogether and live with a fatalistic mindset. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. I don't even know how to spell that in French, but I know how to say it. I also, in today's vernacular, whatever. Right? Or, I heard a friend of mine at seminary, he's not pastoring a church, but he used to say, life stinks and then you die. And I just sit there and say, I don't want to live that way. There's no hope. Life stinks. And he didn't say it that nicely. And then says, and then you die. And I'm just like, I can't buy into that philosophy of life. That's the second option. The third option is, and this is my belief, that this psalm looks at life from the perspective of faith versus fatalism. The writer confesses his faith in the one who made the heavens and the earth. The writer confesses his faith in the one true God, and he believes that God is watching over him and desires his readers to do the same. In fact, what he says is, God is watching over you right now. And so we have a statement then of God's watchful care. And that is focused around a Hebrew word. And I want you to say this with me. Shamar. Let's try that again. Come on, let's get that Hebrew going. It's shamar. And that basically means to watch over, to keep, or to guard. So you may have read in the New Revised Standard Version, you may have read keep. God keeps, God is your keeper. You may have read in the NIV, God watches over. You might read in another version that God guards. Okay, the Lord guards people. All are excellent ways to translate this. Now, again, the whole concept of the idea of watch is not this. Okay, it's not something inanimate. It's something that we need to be very much aware of. A watch can refer to a designated time in which someone takes the responsibility to observe an area. A watch could refer to a patrol of several people who look out for any kind of danger that might be there. In the Old Testament, a watchman would stand on the walls of the city and keep watch over the city at night and during the day. And they would watch for a messenger to come with good news. Does that sound familiar? Isaiah 52 talks about the messenger coming with good news, that God reigns. So these watchmen would stand and watch. Is there a messenger coming? Is there an army coming? Is there an ambush coming? All those kinds of things. You'd watch because your job was to protect the people behind the walls in the city. And so in Psalm 130, one of the other Psalms of Ascent, we read the line that's repeated twice. I love this. More than watchmen wait for the morning. More than watchmen wait for the morning. Well, you can, if you're standing watch at night, you can't wait for dawn, right? I mean, if you've ever done that or been up throughout the night, you just, you know, with kids doing a 7 to 7 party, 7 at night to 7 in the morning, man, anywhere between 3:30 and 6:30 or 7 in the morning, that's the time when I come alive because I'm not going to let anybody sleep. But I tell you, you wait for that sun to come up and the parents come and pick them up and take them home. But more than watchmen wait for the morning. You know, if you're standing watch on a ship or on a wall or at a perimeter, you can't wait for dawn to come because then somebody else's turn and you get a break. But God keeps watch over us. God keeps watch over the ones that he loves, and so the traveler, the pilgrim on the journey would need someone to watch over him or her. Now, there are several concerns for someone who would be on a journey to and from Jerusalem. I mean, one of those concerns is slipping. So think with me to hiking, all right? If you're hiking, could be a trail, could be a mountain, up or down, where you put your foot is an important thing. If you don't put your foot on a solid foundation or on a solid footing, you're going to slip. Then there's the case of injury, and you're not going to be able to complete the journey, right? I mean, I'm sure some of you have had that experience when you have the exhilaration of going up, you get to the top of whatever you're climbing, whether it be Enchanted Rock or, in the Northeast, it's Mount Monadnock, and you get to the top and you get to see everything from out top, and it's beautiful, and you sit too long, and you're like, I'm tired. I got to go back down. And as you go down, sometimes that's even harder than going up because you don't realize how steep it was going up. You realize how steep it is as you're going down, and you're like, whoa, I came up this way? Hopefully that's the way you came up so you can go down. But still, you get the idea that you need a solid place to put your foot. Otherwise, you sprain your ankle, you twist your ankle, worse yet, you break a bone, you fall, you get bruised. Maybe you can't complete the journey. So I think it's important to realize that slip could cause an injury and bring the journey to an end. Another concern is having the one who is watching fall asleep on the job. That would not be a good thing, would it? Okay? Now, what would happen if the Lord was not faithful in watching over us? Well, that takes away the whole idea of faithfulness, doesn't it? And so we've got to think through that. So let me read verses 3 and 4 for us. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Here comes the quiz. Remember everything I taught you back the first time we met? What kind of parallelism is that? Three basic types of parallelism: synonymous, antithetical, and synthetic. Synonymous. Slumber and sleep are words that you will find together. They're called a fixed pair. As you do the as you study Hebrew, if you study Hebrew, you find that in poetry, in Hebrew writing, there are these certain words that go together. These are two of them. It's a fixed pair. If you see slumber, you'll probably see sleep. Okay? It's just a way of getting the point across. It's a way of giving some emphasis. So that we have that there. It's synonymous parallelism, is to say, God's not going to fall asleep on you. No, he's not going to close his eyes just to slumber a little bit, and he's not going to go into a deep sleep. God is going to watch over you. He repeats that there. He'll neither slumber nor sleep. I think that's important for us to remember. We don't have a God who falls asleep on us. You know how you try to stay awake when a child or a grandchild is sick and you want to take care of them, and you find yourself doing these jobs? It's not going to happen with God. That's what the psalmist is telling us. And that's a great promise, that God's not going to slumber or sleep. But even more than that, there's a concern of the perils that come with the night and the day in a journey. But the Lord is with them as he was with their ancestors as they went 40 years through the wilderness. Remember that, where God led them how by day and how by night? Pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Right. Well, here, God is with them and present with them, watching over them. He is referred to as their shade, their protection. That's what shade is. Shade is a metaphor for protection. So the sun will not harm them by day, nor the moon by night. Now, think Middle Eastern culture. Think Middle East. Not a whole lot of trees, all right? It gets hot. Hotter than Texas at times, I think, maybe. All right? You know better than I do, for those of you who have been there recently. But it gets hot and dusty and whatnot, and you're traveling in the sun. Well, what happens when you travel in the sun? People like me with fair skin get sunburned. Now, this is starting to fade. Sandy, what was that like on Monday night?
It was brilliant.
Yeah.
I facetiously thought you might have been in a fire, and then I found out afterwards you were.
Well, yeah, Sandy said two things. John, you were either golfing or you were in a fire. Well, I was at a fire in the, there was a church that burned on the southeast side of town on Monday. I was outside for about 3 or 4 hours. I didn't have sunscreen. We have the miracle of sunscreen these days. People in the Middle East, as they traveled on their journey, did not have sunscreen. You might wonder, why is it that people in the Middle East wear these different layers of clothes, the robes and the headdresses? To protect them from the sun. They know the dangers of the sun, like we do. Of course, when I was a child, they didn't have sunscreen. They did have zinc, but I wasn't going to be Rudolph the White-Nosed Reindeer. And it just doesn't happen. So, they didn't have the sunscreen. Well, the other thing to be aware of is something called moonstroke. And you might say, what the heck is moonstroke? There was an idea even back then that the moon could be a cause of mental illness. Okay? Now, think with me for a second. That's not too crazy. If you've ever worked in an emergency room, when the full moon comes, I'm seeing the nods. Anybody who's worked in an emergency room, and Fred, our doctor, Don, I don't know if you saw it because you were administrator during the day, but anyway, you just talk to anybody in an emergency room and they'll tell you that there is activity that escalates during a full moon. Well, there was this belief even back then that there could be some kind of moonstroke, some kind of mental illness. The word for moon, lunar. It's where we get the word lunacy, okay? It all fits. Now, the sun and the moon represent the fact that there are fears in the journey, right? There's fears for us in life, and some of those fears are rational, and some of those fears are irrational on our part. We make them up in our minds sometimes, right? That we get these fears about this is going to happen if I do this, and we sit down with a friend and say, no, it's not. That couldn't be the furthest thing. But sometimes we get ourselves all wrapped up and just say, this is terrible, everything's going terrible, life's going to Gehenna in a handbasket. I mean, it's terrible. And so what the pilgrims did is they trusted in the Lord who would protect them along the way and care for them. Now, safety was not taken for granted at that point in time. In our culture, we don't think anything of simply getting in our car and going somewhere. But with our children and grandchildren, we want to make sure they put a helmet on when they're riding their bike. We're going to have them ensconced in plastic and foam in our cars. We've got the seat belts over the top. We've got a harness over the top of that. If they're riding a bike, we got wrist guards, we got knee guards, we got elbow, we got the whole deal. We got it all covered, don't we? Where is our trust? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say it's dumb for us to do that. I think we need to take those precautions. But again, as I said to the leaders yesterday, we get in our car, we put on our seatbelt and our shoulder harness, and we'll drive 70, 80, 85 miles an hour down the road, right? I mean, you driven 130 up to Austin, you know, the car starts shaking a little bit sometimes, depends how new it is, but you know, that happens. We have the airbags around us and we're safe. Really? Does that guarantee our safety? No, it doesn't. Ultimately, it doesn't. Does it make sense? Yeah, it makes a lot of sense in our day and age that we strap in and do that. But it doesn't keep us ultimately safe. And so, as I think about our culture, we've placed a lot of trust in things that, on the temporal side of life, can help us. This became very clear to me, gosh, it must have been 35 years ago when I was in Pakistan. I was a seminary student. I think I was 21. And here I was traveling halfway around the world to work with a missions organization with people I've never met. And people were telling my parents at church, I can't believe you're letting your son go to Pakistan. This is in the early 80s. Remember, the Soviets had gone into Afghanistan. The Afghan refugees were going across the border by tens and hundreds of thousands a day. And I was going to take relief supplies to Afghan refugees, okay? The freedom fighters, the ones that we were fighting against recently, okay? So that's the idea. So it's almost 35 years since I went there. The flight went from JFK in New York to Frankfurt to Paris to Cairo to Abu Dhabi to Karachi, where we changed planes, and then we went to Rawalpindi. All right? That gave me a little pause. That was a long, long flight, a lot of up and down. The thing that really kind of got me is I got on, it was Pakistan International Airlines, okay? So we had a choice of, and I didn't know the difference between Pakistani or Continental for food. I was 21, what was I supposed to know? I didn't like either, really, and you know, every leg of the flight they're feeding us more. And so we get to Islamabad, and there's this sea of Pakistani faces. Of course, I stuck out because I was taller, and I'm white. I mean, I'm really white. And I found the guy that was our contact person, and we then proceeded to take a 3-hour drive into the mountains to where we were staying. Now, I thought it was pretty cool that our host, before he started the car, they prayed for a safe journey. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah, the missionary thing, it's cool. They're spiritual. As we started to drive, I realized why we prayed. The drivers are very different from what we experience in Texas or Boston or New York or San Francisco. There's weaving in and out, horns were blaring, oxen and water buffalo would be on the road, people would dart out. I mean, living by faith was truly a way of life. Anytime we got in a vehicle, someone prayed before it was started. That is not a bad discipline. That is not a bad discipline. Several times they had me drive. Now, we had to pray. But have you ever driven on the left side of the road around oxen and water buffalo and people darting in and out? You need to pray. Because it really messes with your head. Think about it. You're driving on the left-hand side of the road, you make a left turn. You make a right turn. You got to change the lanes that you're going in. My first time, I didn't do that real well. After that, Ruthie and I started dating, we got married, whatever. When we took a trip, we would pray before we went somewhere. Okay? Not your basic stuff around town, but the longer trips. You know, if we would travel a couple hours or more, we'd pray before we went. That was a practice we did with our girls all the way, I mean, through college because we just think that that was probably a good thing. Now, truth be told, even now, when I get on a plane, as I'm walking onto the plane off the jetway, I lay my hand on the side of the plane and I pray. I pray that all the systems would work well on the plane, whether they're technological or mechanical or hydraulic or whatever the systems are. I don't know what they are. I can't name them. I can't probably pronounce them, but I pray for that. I pray for the flight crew, for the people flying the plane, and for the people in the cabin. That's not out of superstition. I think that's out of reality for what I've seen in life. And I realize that, you know something? God gives us a gift of life. And we either believe that God watches over us, and that God is present with us, or God is not. For me, it's an act of trust and faith, not an act of superstition. Because I realize who I am and who God is. And I think that's something that I will continue to do. Because safety in the journey is not something that we should take for granted. There were real dangers for the pilgrims on the road. There were real concerns. Having worshiped, they received a blessing of God's ever watchful care. They believed that God was watching over them, and the truth is that they want us to know that God is watching over us. God is watching over you. Really, at the end of the psalm, we find a statement of personal faith in God's watchful care. I think it's clear that the writer believes God is at work and God watches over us, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. In 1985, there was a song written by Julie Gold. She wrote the words, and Bette Midler made it famous. The title, From a Distance. Let me just read the lyrics. From a distance, the world looks blue and green, and the snow-capped mountains white. From a distance, the ocean meets the stream, and the eagle takes to flight. From a distance, there is harmony, and it echoes through the land. It is the voice of hope, it is the voice of peace, it is the voice of every man. From a distance, we all have enough, and no one is in need. And there are no guns, no bombs, and no disease, no hungry mouths to feed. From a distance, we are all instruments marching in a common band, playing songs of hope, playing songs of peace. They're the songs of every man. God is watching us, God is watching us, God is watching us from a distance. From a distance, you look like my friend, even though we're at war. From a distance, I just cannot comprehend what all this fighting is for. From a distance, there is harmony, and it echoes through the land. And it's the hope of hopes. It's the love of love. It's the heart of every man. It's the hope of hopes. It's the love of loves. It's the song of every man. And God is watching us. God is watching us. God is watching us from a distance. God is watching us. God is watching us. God is watching us from a distance. I don't want to know that God's watching from a distance. I want to know that God is watching. But I want to know that God isn't only watching. I want to know and I want to believe that God is actively involved in the day-to-day stuff of life that each one of us goes through. You know, the truth is that God is watching and actively involved, whether we believe it or whether we don't believe it. Because if we don't believe it, it does not negate who God is. It just means that we probably need some more wisdom. The proof that God is watching and actively involved is seen in and through the person of Jesus Christ. In Romans 5:8 we read, "But God demonstrated his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." You see, God was watching, and God did something. And God is watching and is at work in the world through you and me. Verses 7 and 8 wrap up the message of God keeping watch, of God guarding, of God keeping the pilgrims in his care as they embark on their journey home. Think Old Testament, think Moses and Joshua, The promise, I will be with you. Jesus promised to the disciples at the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and lo, I will be with you always. God is present. In verse 7 we read, the Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. That word harm can also be translated evil. That God will God will keep you from all evil. Derek Kidner, in his commentary on Psalm 121, notes that this does not mean that God will give us a cushioned life. On the contrary, trials, challenges, and pain will happen. But the Lord will provide what is needed for us to face those situations. We're not alone in them, but we need to look for God for the strength that we need to get through. What's interesting about the Psalms is that there are Psalms like this which speak of God's blessing and presence, and there are Psalms that convey God's seeming absence in the midst of those crisis moments in life. Usually these concepts are not presented together. Psychologically, the psalmists keep those things apart. Why, I'm not quite sure. Even the commentators aren't sure why that happens. But that's the way they're written. Leslie Allen, who also writes on the Psalms, in his commentary notes this. He said, "It is too complicated to relate philosophically to a God who is present in blessing and to one who is absent, unless human culpability can be accepted as a moral catalyst for a calamity." What we need to remember is that we live in the world of Genesis 3. The world is fallen. There is sin. That's a part of our life. We make bad choices at times. Other people make bad choices at times, and we all live with consequences. But that does not mean that God has abandoned us. That does not mean that God is not watching us. On the contrary, what it means is that sometimes we abandon God. We abandon God. And even in the midst of that, God reaches out to us for an embrace with open arms. For while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It's not about what we've done or could ever do. We could never earn it. We could never, ever earn it. God welcomes us back. God provides us resources we need to get through the tough times. And in the last verse, the Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forevermore. These words are also a fixed pair, now and forevermore, coming and going, okay? Got it? Now and forever, coming and going. They refer to everything. They include all aspects of life: work, family, home, community, politics, medicine, architect, everything. Because God created everything. And so for the pilgrims, the people who were going back and forth to Jerusalem for the festivals, they understood coming and going. Because they would leave their homes in the morning, go out to the fields outside the walls of the city with their flocks or whatever, and then they'd come back at night. The coming and the going and the coming. And then they would go out from worship at the festival in Jerusalem to go to their own homes. Now and forevermore, this is the great part. It starts now. We don't have to wait for God to start watching. It's already been happening. And here's the better part. It doesn't end. It's now and forevermore. We think finitely with our heads. We know that at some point we're going to die physically, right? But God's still watching over us. Because that's not the end. Like it goes on forever. Well, God has been our help. God is our help. And our help still comes from the one who is the maker of the heavens and earth. Our circumstances may change. The reality of God's love, though, and the reality of God's ever watchful care does not change. Our situations change, but the reality of God's presence with us remains. Our emotions may change, but the reality of what God has done for us in and through Jesus Christ does not change and will never, ever change. God is faithful, and God is steadfast, and God's love and care for us, God's watchful care over us, is faithful and steadfast. God's grace and mercy are always available. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forevermore. Those are not empty words. They are not fleeting thoughts. They are not just a trite wish. They are words that are faithful and true. God is near even when God seems far away. God is present even when we don't feel God's presence. And God still stands watch. God still stands watch. One of the passages that I love, that I use at funerals, from Deuteronomy 33:27. The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. It's reality. Whether we want to believe it or not, whether we choose to believe it or not, that is the truth. God is watching over us, and God is watching over you. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, the idea that you watch over us, the idea that you know the details in our lives, it just is, it's almost too wonderful to understand. And sometimes I don't want you watching. And yet, Lord, it causes us to love you even more. That you accept us, that you love us, and that you are wanting to watch over us. Not that you keep us from experiencing the stuff of life, but as we do, you give us the resources to walk through, to know you more, to know ourselves more, and to give you praise. So, Lord, thank you for that. And I pray for each person in this room that they would know your ever watchful care as you keep us, as you watch over us, as you guard us. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.